I love the story that one man told about his time at a Steak and Shake. He was there eating with his family. He needed to go to the bathroom, so he walks in the bathroom, and as soon as he walks in, right in the middle of the bathroom is this 7-year-old boy that is just dancing his heart out. I mean, he is just getting down. He doesn't care who's watching, no matter what's going on. He is just dancing and dancing. And it reminded me, do you remember what it was like to be a kid and you didn't really care at all about what people thought? All of us have at some point did some really crazy things in our life as a kid. As kids, we're fearless. But as we get a little bit older, we begin to lose our courage. It's almost like we're all a member of a club, and we're called that club a dignified club, and we work really hard to protect our membership. Because none of us wants to be embarrassed in front of other people. So none of us would ever be caught dead dancing in a stall at a bathroom like the 7-year-old boy. But I want you to think about these questions today. What if we weren't afraid? If we weren't afraid, would we act differently than we do today? If we were not afraid, would we take a few more risks in our life? If we were not afraid, would we go all in, turn in our dignified card, and just live our life like crazy? Maybe if we had no fear, then we would care a whole lot less about what people thought, and a whole lot more about what God thought. For the past few weeks, we've been looking at this study where we've been looking at songs that David wrote. So today I want to continue this study by looking a little bit not only at his writings, what he talked about worship, but let us see how he actually worshiped. Now, David did write a lot about worship. He paints a great picture for us of how he worshiped. He says things like in Psalms 5, I enter your house by the abundance of your faithful love. I bow down toward your holy temple and reverence all of you. Let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them shout for you forever. Psalm 70 says, I will thank the Lord for his righteousness. I will sing about the name of the Lord the Most High. David, he loved to sing. Psalms 80 says, Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. Psalm 90 says, I will thank the Lord with all my heart. I will declare all your wonderful work. I will rejoice and boast about you. I will sing about your name most high. Psalms 18, he says, I called to the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I was saved from my enemies. David had reason to worship. You see, David saw God moving in his life, so he worshiped God. Now, when we read what David wrote about worship, and then we see how David actually worshiped, we begin to realize that if this guy ever had a dignified card, he handed it in a long time ago. See, David teaches us in his writing a lot about worship, but today I want to take a look of how he worshiped God. And we're going to do that by looking at 2 Samuel chapter 6. But before we dive into that passage in 2 Samuel 6, we need to really set it up. We need to look at the background. First, King Saul was the first king before David became king, and they had pretty much a love-hate relationship. And over time, he got really jealous of David because the people started to love David a little bit more than they loved Saul. Then we see in 1 Samuel chapter 18 that Saul promised to give his daughter, we'll call her Michal. It's pronounced a little bit different in Hebrew, but for my sake and your sake, we'll just call her Michal. But Saul promised to give Michal to David as his wife, but only if David could go out and kill 100 Philistines. Now, Saul was just trying to get rid of David. He just wanted to try to kill David. He had this plan, he had this plot, but David was still going to do it. And David went for it. And he didn't just go out and kill 100 Philistines. He ended up killing 200 Philistines. So he got Michal as his wife. David had no fear whatsoever. Well, Saul's jealousy eventually turned into rage, and David had to spend years of his life running away from Saul while Saul was pursuing him to try to kill him. And over again, this is important, David experienced God's power, God's protection, and God's provision. And while David is on the run, Saul takes his wife Michal and gives her to another guy. So at the end of 1 Samuel 1, Saul dies, David returns to Judah to become the king, and one of the very first things he does is he goes and gets his wife back. So he and Michal are reunited, and we'll see her a little bit later on in the story. But the other thing that David does right off the bat is that he makes preparations to make Jerusalem become the religious center of the kingdom. And he does this by returning the Ark of God back to Jerusalem. Now, the Ark was the visible image of God's presence. So right off the bat, David is setting the stage. He's saying, hey, God is going to be the center of my leadership. He's going to be the center of our kingdom. So we get to pick the story up in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And as David gathers about 30,000 of his very best soldiers together to bring the ark back to Jerusalem, I mean, this is a big deal. Everyone turns out to see what's going on. But they have a big mistake right from the beginning. They're in such a hurry to get everything rolling that they didn't move the ark the way that God had instructed them to move it. And instead of carrying it on poles like God has instructed them to do, this is what it says. It says, they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Now, I think it was very thoughtful for them to decide to put the ark on a brand new cart instead of an old ran down one, but that's not how God instructed them to move it. And that's really important. So the parade rolls on, and they're pulling this cart, and all of a sudden, an oxen that's pulling the cart begins to stumble a little bit. And there's this guy who's walking beside of the ark that did probably what any of us would do. The guy's name is Uzzah. And Uzzah reaches up to steady the ark, to keep it from falling off the cart, and something really bad happens to this guy. In verse 7 it says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. And he died there beside the ark of God. So he touched the ark of God, and God strikes him down. You can imagine the whole parade just comes to a halt. The dancers, the singers, they completely stop. People are running as far as they possibly can to get away from this ark that they're terrified of. You see, God displayed his power, and now he has their full attention. But if you're like me, you're probably thinking, man, that's insane. I mean, what's really the big deal? What kind of God would kill a guy just for trying to help? Well, I want you to notice something from the text. It doesn't say that the ark was actually falling. It just says that the oxen stumbled. So even though Uzzah might have meant well, maybe he was doing a little bit more than God needed him to do. Maybe God didn't need his help at all. God knew what was going on. God had everything under control. God can take care of himself, and he really didn't need Uzzah's help. But really more important than that, I want you to catch this. God's powerful, and he demands our obedience. He demands honor. He demands reverence. And this guy defied the law of God and touched the ark. And God is not about to be manipulated. He's not going to be dishonored. He's powerful, and he commands our respect and our obedience. And now all of the people know about God's power firsthand. Well, David gets angry. He didn't understand why God had to kill Uzzah the way that he did for just touching the ark. And he's about like you and me. He's full of emotions, full of reactions. So David gets angry at God. Let me ask you, do you ever get angry at God over something that might happen in your life? David did. And then his anger eventually turned to fear, because David experienced the power of God, and it made an impression on him and on his heart. Now, when I study the Old Testament, I have to tell you, I'm always reminded of the reverence that I am supposed to have for God. I love to see God as my best friend, as filled with grace and loving, and he is all of those things. But you know what? The Bible also teaches us that God is holy, that he's powerful, that he's wrathful, that he is just. He's God, and I am never to bring him down to my level. And now the people who saw what had happened, they know that very well. So after taking a little bit of break with the ark, they're now ready to try this all over again. And it says, and it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. Now they're carrying the ark like they were commanded to. God's got their attention. They're even making sacrifices as they're going along their way. Now they're being obedient and more reverent to their care and worship of God. And verse 14 tells us, and David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. Now notice David is in front of everything. He's wearing an ephod, which is not something that a king would normally wear. It would almost be like if our president came out with a tank top during the State of the Union address. It would just be a little out of place and a little weird. And an ephod is something that a priest would wear. It's short, it's very tight-fitting. It would have covered everything, but it would have given him a chance to move a little bit. So David, he's not dressed at all like a king. And the other thing we notice is that he's not really acting like a king either. He's leading the parade. He's wearing pretty much an apron, and he's dancing like a 7-year-old at Steak and Shake. And everybody's watching. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody is watching him. David turns in both his dignity card and his man card all at once. He is this powerful warrior and leader, and he has just lost himself in the worship of God. And you know what? He doesn't care. See, David was all in for God. And verse 16 says, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of her window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. Did you catch that? Michal, his wife, she's not in the parade. She's up out of the way. She's acting like royalty, away from the crowd. She's dignified. She's an observer, not a participant. So the text will go on to say, and she despised him in her heart. Michal's not liking how David's acting at all. Ladies, I have to ask you, do you ever get frustrated of how your husband acts at times? This is a little over the top. This is a little frustrating. She's so embarrassed about how David is acting that she's actually hating him for the way that he's worshiping God. And verse 20 tells us, and David returned to bless his household, But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." So here's David. He's dancing into his house. It's probably one of the best moods that he has ever been in his life. Coming off of this great experience, this awesome worship service, and Michal meets him at the door. And she just lets him have it. She won't let him off the mat. David probably felt like the guy that was sitting in his living room, and he could hear at the back door his dog barking, wanting to come in, and he could hear at the front door that his wife's yelling at him, wanting her in as well, and he just decides, I'm going to go and let the dog in, because at least I know the dog's going to stop barking at some point. Sorry, ladies. Michal wears David out, though, because of how he's worshiping God. She tries to pressure him and judge him and condemn him with what he's doing. But David, he's unfazed. He doesn't mind. And it says, and David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all your house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord." Verse 22 in the NIV goes on and says, "And I will become even more undignified than this. And I will be humiliated in my own eyes, but by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." He said, I'm even going to become more undignified than what you have just seen me do. Two different people at one of the biggest parties to honor God in all of history, and we see two completely different responses. David dances. Michal despises. One is very joy-filled. The other is very hate-filled. Why is that? I mean, how in the world can, in the same worship service, cause two different people to have two completely different reactions? What would make that kind of act something like that? To not act like a king. And why in the world is this wife despising her husband for it? Remember, David was a shepherd. And God had provided for him, protected him time and time again while he's preparing him to be king. For David, everything that he experienced for his preparation as king, it shaped his relationship with God. And it caused him to come to a place where he valued God so much. We see it in the things that he wrote. Like we have seen earlier, Psalms 13 says, "But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Said, I will sing to the Lord because what I have experienced from the Lord. He has treated me generously. We read it, but then we get to see how he actually worshiped. So it's really not that hard at all to understand why David worshiped God the way that he did. Because David's experience with God drove him to his worship. And the same is true with us. You see, the heart of a worshiper is shaped by our encounters with God. Our experience with God drives our worship of God. The word worship actually comes from a word that means worthship. It's an Old English word, means to give worth to something. I love what Zach Neese says. He says, if worship is ascribed worth to God, then the price of our worship shows God and the world how much we value him. Our worship shows the world how much we value God. He goes on to say, if the cross proves how much we are worth to God, our worship proves how much God is worth to us. David didn't let fear or perception about how the king should act drive his worship of God. He acted unkeenly. He acted undignified because of what he knew about God. And it all exploded from when he was in the presence of God. So David danced. On the other hand, there's Michal. Michal had experienced the life of a king. Notice in this passage, she's never really referred to as David's wife. She's always referred to many times as Saul's daughter. She's more aligned with that kind of lifestyle, the lifestyle of Saul, than David's own lifestyle. The life of David, he knew how a king was supposed to act, or she did. She wore the clothes, she had the classes, she knew the drills. She didn't take part in the things like the common people did. The way of a king's life meant more to her than anything else. So as an observer, Michal flashes her dignity card. And when she saw David out of uniform, leaping around and jumping and dancing and worshiping God, undignified and making a fool of himself, she's ticked off. She's really ticked off. She's embarrassed. Because it was about her. It wasn't about God. Now, every week we all come together. We come together to worship. And honestly, we can come into this building and we can carry on with our own version of what it would look like. But we also carry with ourselves our own personal experiences with God. And we have to wrestle with this tension of how do I maintain my dignity, but also show God just how much He's worth to me. Our experience with God drives our worship of God. David experienced the power of God, and he danced because of it. So what about us as a church? I'm not saying that we got to get up and dance in the aisle, but our experience, does people really see how much God means to us with the joy that's on our face? I'm always reminded, I go back, I guess it's because that's where we're at now, but when somebody finds out you're pregnant or you find out you're pregnant, that joy, you just can't hold it in. Everybody that sees you is going to know there's something different. You're so happy. Why? Is that the same thing that we have for God? Because when I look around this room, knowing many of your stories and the struggles that you have faced and how God has been moving in your life, I wonder, I hope, that if somebody wanders into our worship service for the very first time, as they watch us worship, will they see just how much God means to us? Just how much we think He's worth. Let me even make it a little bit more personal. How about you? Does your worship reflect how much you value God? What experiences do you have in your own life that shapes your heart for worship, that should really cause you to light up with joy, to maybe even dance? What is it that keeps you from turning over that dignity card, to getting rid of those worries, those fears, and worshiping God like He deserves? And I'll end with this question. What keeps you from turning your life over to Him? Because that's showing Him how much He's worth to us, that we're willing to give our life to Him because what He's done for us. Maybe you have a decision today. If you do, come now as we stand and sing.